So thanks everybody for coming, and welcome on behalf of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, and I'm going to name the other organizations that have helped us. Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, the Lawfare Project, Students Supporting Israel, Canadians for the Rule of Law, and End Jew Hatred Canada, which, as I explained to several people earlier, is really an attempt to create a social movement, a civil rights for the Jews movement, as opposed to establish a new organization. And we're also very appreciative of Minden Gross welcoming us today and allowing us to use their facilities. And they provided the coffee and the drinks. I'm Andrea Spindle, for anybody who doesn't know me, but I think I've met everybody now. I always describe CAEF as a small but mighty national charitable organization that promotes Zionism, Jewish pride, the truth about Israel, and interfaith relations. Today's Zionism, anti-Semitism, is primarily based on anti-Zionism, and it's stoked by lies and bigotry against the only Jewish state. Today's speaker is not addressing anti-Semitism per se, but what he is addressing, I think, does compound the negative impact on Israel that is being exacerbated across the globe, really. The discord within Israel is good fodder for our enemies. Israel is a country that operates under the rule of law, and internal issues there must be seen in context. I'm grateful that we have Yotam today for what I call a close encounter. And now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing today's moderator, Noah Lewis. Noah has been completing his articles at Kramer, Simon, and Dillon, and will be called to the bar at the end of June. So he's a week away from being official. So we wish him lots of luck. Noah actively engages in Jewish advocacy initiatives in the community and has been involved with organizations including Honest Reporting Canada, Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, and Hillsborough Fellowships. In 2020, with support from the UK Lawyers for Israel and the Lawfare Project, Noah received media attention, some of you might remember this, from drawing attention to the toxic anti-Semitic environment he experienced the year prior while he was studying at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and for securing a substantial settlement from the school. While attending their dual JD program at the University of Windsor and the University of Detroit Law School, Noah was treasurer of Windsor's Jewish Law Students Association and a member of the Jewish Law Students Association's Moot team that won first place in the 2022 Jewish Legal Network annual Moot Court competition. And I can tell you from some of the contacts we've had, the Windsor Jewish law students have had a lot on their plate. They have really faced a lot of issues and anti-Semitism there. And so it's incredible to realize that it's fallen on the students to deal with faculty members. So now I'd like to welcome Noah to formally introduce Yotam and handle our questions.
So as I think we all know, we're here to listen and have a nice open conversation with Yotam. Yotam's a Israeli lawyer and is the CEO of the Legal Forum for Israel, which is a non-for-profit that acts to preserve democratic values and create a balance between Israel's free governmental authorities and pretty much to defend human rights and Israel's national and legal interests abroad. Over the course of his career, Yotam has been involved in numerous legal battles, and most notably, what he was just telling me, his first case litigating was actually a BDS case that ended up all the way at the Supreme Court, which is quite a interesting way to start off a pretty distinguished legal career. And Yotam is published all the time writing about his various legal issues that arise in Israel, and most notably now with all the discussion surrounding judicial reform in Israel has been the top of, been around everywhere, pretty much giving his insights and sort of explaining sort of the nuances of what's being pushed with these judicial reforms. So this is Yotam, and I think a good place to start off would be just give us a little summary of kind of what's going on in Israel. We're hearing lots of stuff about judicial reform. Judicial reform is not always seen as necessarily being a bad thing. So how do we kind of get into this place where we got people protesting in the streets? Some people are applauding it. We need judicial reform, and other people are worried. And so maybe just let's start off with a little summary.
Okay, so I will stand because if I speak.
Except the camera's on.
Yeah.
It's good.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. So, when we're speaking about the judicial reform, first of all, we're not really speaking about the judicial reform. And that's the first thing that I want to put on the table. Because the judicial reform today sound like the most main issue that we have in Israel right now. But if we look just a year ago, or a year and a half ago, or 10 years ago, we will see that we still had demonstrations in Israel. And we still had the same powers that goes against each other. And so why the judicial reform definitely put a lot of people in the streets that wasn't in this protest. But there is in Israel a battle that doesn't only because of the judicial reform. It's battle that if we want for understanding the forces that happening in Israel, we need to look much before. And in order to understand what this, we need to go to the history. And I speak history, I'm not going to go very far history. I'm going to speak only about the last 40 years. Around 1977, there was a big mapach, revolution in Israel. And the revolution was that after a long years that the left was controlling in Israel, the left parties was controlling Israel, in 77, the Likud won the election. That was a big issue in Israel. I mean, the encores in the news channel went crazy. They says, we don't believe that this actually can happen. Think after like for almost 30 years that there was only one party that controlled Israel, everything got changed. And that's make a lot of people rethink about the way that they thinking about Israel. One of these people, one of the groups that actually rethink about this was a left-wing groups. And I speak in left wing. I'm not going to speak now. There is different kind of left and right, but I will explain you exactly what I mean when I'm saying left. So the left wing group was understood that there is a problem. One of them was the New Israel Fund. I don't know if you all heard about the New Israel Fund. At 1982, they established a program named the Judicial Program of the New Israel Fund. The idea of the program was taking very promising lawyers from the offices in Israel, mostly from the governmental offices, and send them to do a master on the account of the New Israel Fund. And when they did the master in United States or UK, they all they need was supplied by the New Israel Fund, and they have only one condition. After you're going back to Israel, you need to volunteer 1 or 2 years in our organizations. That's the way they managed to make a group of people that study in their ways and got their values. That was 1982. If you look today, you will see that people that was in this program right now sitting in the Supreme Court of Israel. And they are in the prosecution in every place in Israel that you can even think about in the legal ways, legal measures. That's something that it's not under the surface. You can find it in the website of the New Israel Fund. And that's why they did it. If we look on this program, why it started right after 77, why they decide to do all this program and send these people to these people. And for understanding it, we need to understand what they felt. They felt that in the first time, since the Israel established, that they're not in control. So they figure out the ways how we can get into control. One of the ways was go through the judicial system, because they understood the judicial system keeping a lot of power inside her. That's the background of what today happened in Israel. Now, I will stop speaking about the New Israel Fund and the left-wing organizations. I just want to give you the idea about what is all about. Because in Israel we have a big fight. The fight is not about judicial system. It's not about Netanyahu, even that all the demonstration you heard about Netanyahu. It's about a Jewish nation law or all Israel's or all citizen law. That means a citizen, a state that giving the same thing, the same, let's say, rights, even national rights, to all the citizens in Israel. That means non-Jewish state. And that's the big argument that eventually getting us to all this point. And if we will look backward, we'll see that in every case in the last 20 years that was argument in Israel, it goes to this point. Now I'm going to go to the judicial reform, but I see that you want to ask a question?
Well, you make it sound something's wrong about being left. There should be some balance. What was it that the left problem? What's the opposite? That's what I.
So first of all, I didn't say that it was wrong to be left. I said this is what the left did. I mean, they understood that they have a problem in one way, and they found a solution to other way. I didn't say it's bad what they did. For my perspective, as someone that cares about Israel as a Jewish nation state, that for me can be problematic, because when I'm looking at it, I see that they influence on the states on the ways that I don't want to. But I didn't say it wasn't democracy. I didn't say it wasn't like their own right to do. It's just that they did things that we didn't even understand, and that gave us to the situation that we are now. So I didn't spoke about what good or bad. So it's important to me to say it, because even that I don't agree a lot of time with the other side doesn't mean that we don't have a right to do what they're doing. So that was the progress. Now, when speaking about the judicial reform, so how we got even into the problem that the judicial system, even if people in Israel care about. I mean, most of the places when I'm going to speak and I ask, how many of you knows how your judicial system even was, who is the people in the judicial system? What is the structure of the judicial system? Most of the people in different states doesn't know. If you are a lawyer, it's one thing. But if you are not a lawyer, people doesn't care. And now in the last year, we went into the election only about the judicial subject. And for understanding this, so I had a conversation before with one of you that says, Israel doesn't have a constitution, and I have the understanding that because Israel doesn't have a constitution, that influence on all the system. So that's definitely one of the problem. How it happened in 1948, when we established Israel, David Ben-Gurion, it was in a big fight. I mean, there was 5 different armies that came into Israel and tried to destroy Israel. So when you are in the middle of a fight, you don't want to solve every specific issue that you have. You want just to go to the fight and win the fight and establish a state. And there is a lot of issues in Israel. Definitely a lot of big issues. You know, it's the same, what was in 1948, it's the same that we have today. Who will serve in the army, how will be a religious state or not a religious state, and if it's not will be a religious state, in which part will be more religious and not religious, how you can decide what is Jewish nation state. I mean, there is a lot of arguments about what is Jewish nation state. Just a few years ago, we had a new law in Israel, base law in Israel, that says Jewish nation state law. This law determined things that making Israel more Jewish. And that was a big argument. There was a big protest in the streets. 200,000 people came out to the street to protest. So there is a big argument, and that argument was in 1948 also. So they understood that they can't have a constitution right now. So they said, let's do the mechanism that the next Knesset will do the constitution. And what happened in the next Knesset? Israel still was in a bad shape, and still no one wants to decide in this hard question. So they said, we will do a way that we're not going to do a constitution by full. We'll do certain laws that eventually will be a constitution. After all the legislation of this law will end, there will be a constitution. That was the base law of Israel. And they did some base laws. But one area that no one even touched and no one wants to touch at this time was what will be the values of a state. There was a different laws that was about the structure of a state, about the symbols, but no one wants to touch in the values because it was too problematic and too argumental. And what happened is that around the 80s, they had a vacuum. And when every time that we have a vacuum, what's happened? Someone get into this vacuum, because you can't left anything. That's by the law of physics. There is no vacuum in the nature. When you have a vacuum, will something else get inside? And around the 80s, something changed. And what changed? So first of all, that's something. There was a question in how the court can overrule decision of the governments. Pay attention. I'm speaking about the government and not the Knesset. There is a different meaning. The Knesset is laws, and the government is decisions. So the government had a certain decision, but the Supreme Court didn't like, and there was a big argument about in which ways we can, the Supreme Court can decide against these decisions. One way was an heritage that we have from the British Mandate. Our heritage was that in the British Mandate, the judges have the option to overrule decision of the government by says something is not reasonable. Now, reasonable is definitely something amorphous. No one can actually determine what reasonable are. Because when I ask each one of you what is reasonable, we will say different answers about this. Because it's coming from the values of a person. I think this is reasonable or not reasonable. And so we had an heritage from the British Mandate. But the heritage says that we can use it only in the most extreme situations. That any person can say this is unreasonable. And Aaron Barak, that was a Supreme Court justice at this time, he wasn't a Chief Justice yet, he was a Supreme Court justice. He was in a case that says, I will change this thing, and from this day and more, I don't need only for in the most extreme cases. I can use unreasonableness in every case that I think. That changed a lot of things, because till then, it was the Supreme Court. When you say something is reasonable, you need to think an excuse why it's not. When I'm ruling against something, I need to explain why I ruled against it. When I say something unreasonable, I don't even need to give another excuse, because I said it's unreasonable. So that's one thing that was in the 80s. If you want to go deeper, you'll find it in a case named Dapei Za'av. This is the name of the case. Eventually, we're gonna go to 92. In 92, the Knesset did another law, a base law, the human dignity law. The human dignity was very controversial, because there was forces in the Knesset that tried to pass this law in the 5-6 years before. And every time that it got into legislation, someone said, I'm too scared from it. Because when you say human dignity, I don't want to give the Supreme Court, it's the first time that we're speaking about values. Pay attention, this is the base law, the first time that we have a base law about values. And people said, if I will do a base law about values, that will give the Supreme Court maybe the power to overrule my other decisions. So they're really scared about it. And eventually, in 92, the head of a committee that was dealing this law, he says, I promise you that he's not going to give a power to the Supreme Court. The Minister of Justice says, I promise you this, he will not give this power to the Supreme Court. In 92, it passed. In 95, it was the first time that the Supreme Court implied it on a certain case and says it's giving me the power to overrule the laws of the Knesset. That's where the vacuum that we had made us a big problem today. Because in the moment that it says that we have a power to overrule the decision of the Knesset, now we are in a different system. I mean, where every democracy most of democracies have 3 branches. That's the system that Montesquieu, when he spoke about what will be democracy, he says we need the legislation, you need the executive, and you need the judicial, and that will balance each other. So since 48 till 92 or the 80s, we have kind of balanced system in Israel. There's legislation that making the laws decide what will be the norms of a society, and we have the executive taking this into imply on the cases that are actually happening and implying it on the reality. And we have a judicial that was criticized in places that there was problems. In 92, suddenly all the balance changed. In 95, because suddenly the judicial is not only criticized. Now they actually have the power to overrule the decisions. So that changed all the way that we're thinking in Israel. Now in 95, most of the people didn't even understand this issue. You know, I had a professor in law school that was very close to Aaron Barak. He was a friend of Aaron Barak. And he's the most extreme left, but so we don't share the same idea. He's actually the guy established B'Tselem. So we have different ideas about and different values. But he told me one thing. When he told me a lot of things, but in this particular subject, he said when Aaron Barak ruled in 95 in the Mizrahi case, and he sent me the ruling, and he asked him, do you read my ruling? He told him, I will not read a ruling of 300 pages. I mean, he wrote 300 pages in around the 160. He wrote this because of the human dignity law. I can overrule other laws. So no one even understood the problem, and that's take us to 2000. In the area of 2000, people start to understand there is a problem, because suddenly the Supreme Court, that before it wasn't overruled the Knesset, suddenly he started becoming much more activist. He have more power. He can do influence more on the Israeli society. So he starts ruling in different cases. Now, a lot of the people against the judicial reform argue that the Israeli Supreme Court is not really activist. And when they argue about this, they're giving us they says, if you look closely, you will see that the Supreme Court actually overruled the decision of the Knesset only in 22 cases since the beginning of Israel. So first of all, the first case was around the 90s. So that means that it's definitely become much more activist than it was before. Second, the Supreme Court in Israel is very smart. And sometimes you don't even need to overrule the law instead if you want to go against this law. And I'm going to give you an example. For example, you know the BDS law in Israel. There is BDS law, anti-BDS law in Israel. This anti-BDS law says that if someone is encouraging BDS and hurting someone else, you can sue him. In civil law, you can sue him and get money. What the court says, it says, I'm okay with this law. I will not overrule this law, but I will change only one thing in the law. And that's you have to show that you personally got damage because of the say of the person that spoke about BDS. Now, because of this, since the law was passed around 2014 till today, we didn't have any one case that connected to BDS, because you can show straight damage from someone speaking. I mean, the only way to show it if someone will speak and say you cancel your order to this person hotel, but it's very hard to show this stuff, and that was against the idea of all this law. So that's why this, in certain ways, you can actually implement even if you're not overruled all the law. So that's why we said that it's very active. And if we look around 2000, I'm going back to 2000, because in 2000 there was a lot of cases that the Supreme Court got involved very actively in the way of how the army was dealing. For example, the army says in Gaza Strip there was a road that the terrorists always attack people and murder people. And in this road, the army says there was houses of Palestinians right by the road, and the army wants to destroy them because it said it's too dangerous and the terrorists hiding behind them. That was in 2003. And when we got into the Supreme Court told them, think again. It didn't tell them we're going to overrule you. It says, think again. And the army fought again because he understood what the Supreme Court told him. He says, if you're going to keep going, we're going to overrule your decision. So, but he was implying, he said like, think again about what he said. So they didn't destroy the houses. A year later, an whole family got murdered from these houses. And that's how the Supreme Court decision can influence. So we start to understand that there is a lot of influence on the Supreme Court decisions in Israel. And that's, and I'm not gonna speak a lot about Gush Katif, but in the area of Gush Katif, in the time of Gush Katif, there was all the Israeli, because I spoke already, so at Thursday, but in the time of Gush Katif, I'm gonna start by saying before. The reason, when we ask people about why the Israel need to be activists, the Israel Supreme Court need to be activists, always the answer was because he's the human rights defender. It's actually the same thing that they argue today. When you're going now and speaking with someone that's against the judicial reform, the most argument we'll see because the Supreme Court defend our rights. Now, that's a good argument if the Supreme Court was really defending the rights. So in 2004, that we went into protest against the evacuation from Gush Katif and the plan to evacuate Gush Katif. So the Supreme Court disappeared, and it actually doesn't even disappear. It actually was taking part against the people that protest. He put girls in custody for 3 weeks in jail. Girls 14 years old. He was sending kids to re-education in kibbutz because there was protesting against the evacuation. Now when you see the protesters in Israel, no one touched them. There is even one got arrested or got criminal charges against him. When all the protests that we see in the last half month. In Gush Katif, 6,000 people got arrested, 700 criminal charges was against people. A lot of my friends wouldn't go to the army because they got criminal charges against them. So the army didn't took them to serve. And the Supreme Court was behind it. The Supreme Court, these cases came to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says it's danger to the democracy in Israel if we're going to let these potatoes to keep protest. So where the human defender was, the human rights defender was disappeared. So now when we say, okay, so it's a human rights defender, but only in certain cases. So how we can define in which cases is defend and which cases is not defending. And when we look on this, we can see that there is a very clear line that you can see in which places he decide to defend and which cases not. And that always go to the values of the Supreme Court judges. Because now I'm going to take all the things that I said and I'll show you how it's implemented exactly on the Supreme Court. So I spoke about the ways that they can do, that they can overrule decisions. I spoke about the power to overrule decisions of the Knesset, and I spoken about in which cases they're actually doing it. And that's going to the values of the judges, because we all know, and people say, you don't give the politician to determine who the judges will be. Because it's very dangerous to give a politician, every politician have things that he wants to push, everything that things that we want to do. And we don't want the politician to be in the Supreme Court. But the politician already in the Supreme Court. Because when you look on the people of the Supreme Court and the ruling, you can know exactly what the political agenda on each judge by is ruling. So if you already have politicians, so why we don't want to have politicians to represent ourselves in the Supreme Court? So now I actually got into two things that we have in the judicial reform. The first one is about the unreasonableness of the Supreme Court. When the court decides to do something because it's unreasonable. That's one issue that actually now, today, Netanyahu spoke yesterday about his will to keep it going. Because the judicial reform, like it was represented a few months ago, is not going to be the same. No one actually going to imply the same judicial reform. But there is things that's still going to go, and Netanyahu spoke yesterday that he wants to change the idea of unreasonableness. The other one is the way of who is the judges in the Supreme Court. And that's maybe the biggest issue that we have. who's the judges in the Supreme Court, how they getting elected, and in which ways they can overrule the decision of the Knesset. And that's something is very debatable right now, and I think this is the most debatable subject that we have in judicial reform. I will put it in the side, and I would speak only on about another one subject that we have, because this issue is also Netanyahu said that he's gonna keep going with this issue. So I think it's very important to understand what he speak about. And that's the legal advisor of the government. The government legal advisor in Israel is the most powerful position that we have. Why? First of all, is also the general attorney. That means the government legal advisor that advise to the government prosecute them. So how you can get advices for someone that prosecute you? So he's the head of a prosecution. That means if he decide to prosecute someone, he have the power to prosecute him. For example, Yaakov Ne'eman. I don't know if you heard this name. Yaakov Ne'eman was the Minister of Justice in Israel. He also, before he was the Minister of Justice, he was the head of the biggest firm in Israel. And when he was appointed to be a Minister of Justice, he came to the General Attorney, the government legal advisor at this time, and told them, I'm going to replace you because I don't think you're doing a good job. Day later, they opened investigations against him. He was retired, and it took him 9 years to find non-guilty in court. That's the power of a prosecution. The head of a prosecution can use the power of the prosecution to do political move in Israel, to move political things. And Yaakov Ne'eman wasn't the only one. I can easily say another at least 5 people that was in these roles that had the criminal charges against them, and some of them was found guilty in like very small minority things. The other one found non-guilty. One of them was the head of a bar association that they opened 4 different investigations against them, 4 different criminal charges. It was in the time of Aaron Barak in the committee of appointing judges, and we sit together with him in the committee. And he didn't like Aaron Barak. So they opened, I'm not saying Aaron Barak opened, but they opened 4 different investigations against him, 4 different trials. Eventually, he found non-guilty in all of them. His name was Dror Choter Ishai. So that's the power of a prosecution. But the general attorney have another power, and that power is very scary. Today in Israel, he can have a veto right on the government decision. How he have a veto right? So the government have to take his advice. And if they take his advice, he can say to them, I don't agree with what you're doing. So usually when you have an advisor that doesn't agree with what you want to do, you are replacing him and getting a different advisor. I mean, if I was under a trial and my lawyer says, I'm not going to represent you, I don't agree with you, I will take another lawyer. So the government can't fire this person because in order to appoint general attorney or to fire, you need a committee that 2 of the committees was appointed by the government legal advisor. And you need 4 or 5. 4 from 5. So he says to the government, I will not let you to represent yourself in front of the Supreme Court. And what happens is when you're going to the Supreme Court and someone appeal against the decision, you're getting into the Supreme Court, and there is 2 people in the Supreme Court, one that against it and the other one that against it. And the government didn't even have the option to represent themselves. So that's another thing that Netanyahu said yesterday that he's going to change. So that's the 2 things that now Netanyahu is speaking of. And I think it's very important for you for understanding what really happened, what's speaking of right now in Israel. So now I spoke about who will be the judges. So there is a committee of appointing judges in Israel, and the idea of the reform was to change the way of appointing judges, that the politician will get much more power in the committee, because today in the committee, the judges, there is Supreme Court judges in the committee that have a veto right about who will be a Supreme Court judge. In this case, they're controlling the values and the people, the identities, the people that getting into the Supreme Court. And for this way, we're not representing the public we are the public, but we're not getting represented in front of the Supreme Court. It's a lot of information. This is why I'm going to stop now. I'm just going to explain why I said it. I said it for a certain reason. Because all the judicial reform came from the point of the people that doesn't feel that they actually can imply on the state of Israel. when I'm going to election and I'm putting my vote into the kalpi, of the election, I can choose whoever I want and even win the election. But eventually, when they try to do what what I've chosen for, they can't do anything because it's getting into the judicial system. Maybe it can be the government legal advisor or the Supreme Court, and eventually it will stop. And we have so many examples for it. So if when I'm going to vote, I don't get any representation and I can actually imply on the state, this is why it makes so many people cares about the judicial system in Israel. Now, I will explain why the other people so scared about it, because I think it's something that we need to know. The people that protest against the judicial reform really scared. I said they scared about, first of all, because it says the Supreme Court is the human rights defender. Now, this says if we're going to give the power to the Knesset to choose who will be the Supreme Court judges, that means they control the Supreme Court. If they control the Supreme Court, there will no balance between the branches, because the Supreme Court will be in their favor. And if the Supreme Court will be in their favor, so when they decide, for example, we have a say in Israel, if the Knesset will pass a law that says you need to kill all the ginger heads. So that's a say what we always said in Israel. And so if they pass a law that we need to kill all the ginger heads, so the court could not help us. And that's something that's very scary. I mean, if I was like, I'm a person that would have a ginger head son. I don't have, but if I had. So I was scared that my son will be prosecuted. And that's something that I want someone to defend from it. But so it's very scary. But the reality is that, first of all, that the Supreme Court is not defender of the human rights. The Supreme Court defender of human rights that he wants to defend. Second, that the Knesset can't actually go and take the Supreme Court. And why? Because in Israel, if you are appointed to be a Supreme Court judge, you will be a Supreme Court judge until the age of 70. You can't fire a Supreme Court judge. That means that if you will in 48 years old and you now will be in the Supreme Court for 22 years, and the Knesset can put to make new Supreme Court judges only when they are retired. So averagely in Israel, every Knesset appoint 2 Supreme Court judges. We have 15. That means in order to actually to take over the Supreme Court, we need at least 4 Knessets that all the Knessets think the same. And that's something that we never had in Israel. I mean, if you look back, you see that every coalition in the history of Israel had different parties inside. Some of them, for example, it's not left and right. The Haredic parties are not left or right. They are Haredic parties. Lieberman, that doesn't like the Haredic parties, is from the other side because he wants more secular state and they want more religious state. So let's say the Haredic are in the coalition. So they will say, we want representative in the Supreme Court. And if Lieberman, he will say, I want representative in the Supreme Court. And if Meretz party, he will say, I care about the Palestinian rights, so I want someone in this case. So that makes sure that there is no one party or one prime minister that actually can appoint whoever he wants. There is a lot of different coalitions, but every coalition put different people with different views because that represents them at this time. So now I will really stop, and I will get questions because I don't want to put too much information.
So I was going to start off with,
Yeah.
please, if you've got a question.
I'm sorry, I have to go at 1:30, but I want to go back to something you said about the unreasonableness. I'm not exactly sure what you're saying because I'm just thinking in terms of the Canadian context. In administrative law, public law, we have basically 2 standards, correctness and reasonableness. Reasonableness actually gives the decision maker more power for the judge. So the judge cannot overturn the decision because reasonableness, as we understand it, at least as I understand it, is a decision maker has a number of alternatives, and we're going to give deference to the decision maker. And it may be not what we had decided, but it's what the decision maker decided, and it was a reasonable decision because it's with amongst the alternatives, so we're not going to interfere. Is that the same concept that you're talking about?
Yeah, but in Israel, it's not getting back for the person that decide. It's only staying in the Supreme Court. That means if I will say something, I can, let's say I have a government and I decide to appoint someone to a specific role. And so if someone appeal against it to the court, he can argue whatever he wants. But the Supreme Court can say this was unreasonable to appoint him to this role. So that's giving him the option not to give any excuse. Now there is other things in Israel that he can rule by. For example, conflict of interest. He can say, like for example, it was relative to the minister that appoint this guy. So we know that there is a conflict of interest. So he can say that was a conflict. This is conflict of interest. So this is why you can rule it off. But today, he doesn't even need to go to the conflict of interest because he doesn't just say this is unreasonable. Now, the idea is to take this power off. They actually doesn't speak about taking all off. They're speaking about taking back to the place that it can use only the most extreme cases. But the idea is to make the Supreme Court have to give a real explanation about his ruling. And there is a lot of ways that the Supreme Court can rule in Israel. You can say, let's say, a conflict of interest. You can say something is not proportional. For example, we have, let's say that you took someone's house because you want to build a road. So that's something that actually you can do in Israel. If the government want to make a road, they can take someone's house and paying money for it. So let's say that you decide to take someone's house, but you don't really want to do the road. You want to do a trail. And so you can say, and you move it because it's interrupt you in the view. So he says it's not proportional. You can't take this thing because it's a small trail. So you can't take some house because of a small trail. There is a different way to explain if you want to explain why you did your ruling. The unreasonableness giving them the option to rule when they want and without giving a real excuse.
So when I go before, and I'm still a little bit confused, but if I'm going before the court on a decision of, and I'll make it into some sort of very similar, a teacher in a discipline tribunal, okay, and the teacher is disciplined by the tribunal, the college, the regulatory body, okay, and they go up to a higher level and they want that decision to be appealed. We would call it judicial review. You're telling me that the Supreme Court would just simply, it's for me to, and the way we work in Canada is we'd have to argue that the decision that the tribunal made was sort of outside the options of that it had. So it wasn't within the alternatives. It was something outside the alternatives.
But if it's in the alternative, so you can't argue this, right?
Well, you're always trying to argue that it's not. But in Israel, you're trying to say that the Supreme Court could just, that you have to justify why it's reasonable, and the Supreme Court could just come in and say, well, we find it to be unreasonable, and it doesn't give any explanation?
Yeah. That happened, for example, in a case of a professor from Ben Gurion University, that Ophir Akunis, he was the minister of
Is this the Chaim Weizmann Prize?
No, it's not the Chaim Weizmann Prize. Ophir Akunis was the Minister of Science in Israel. And one of his roles was to appoint people to a committee between us and Germany. So there was a committee that was suggesting to put some professor in this committee from Ben Gurion. Now, the professor from Ben Gurion, she published a paper that says, don't go to the Israeli army. So he says, I don't want to put someone that going against Israel in a committee that representing Israel in Germany. So that case came to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overruled him, and he says you have to appoint her, even that the law specifically says that it is on decision. The committee is not obligatory, the recommendation of the committee. So they says, even that the law says specifically that he will decide, the Supreme Court says you have to listen to the committee and appoint her. And why? Because your decision is not reasonable.
But sorry, I don't want to monopolize it, but this conversation, but that's also a judiciable issue. I mean, that's to say that the minister has no discretion. So there's no discretion. You understand what I'm trying to say? In Canada, look, that's your discretion. We're not going to interfere with it. That's more of an example of the fact that the Supreme Court in Israel thought that the ministers, I mean, to me, that's just crazy, right? The ministers should be able to appoint whomever they want to a committee, and a court doesn't have the ability to interfere with that. In other words, it's non-judiciable. But that's a problem with the Supreme Court.
So for me, it's like both. It's because this is the reason that you use. I mean, you sometimes can say that you have a certain excuse, but eventually they use the reasonableness in almost every case because it's very easy to them, instead for actually getting into the case, and then you have to explain yourself in things that we, the regular people, can actually argue. Now, when you say something that is unreasonable, I can argue with unreasonable. I can say that I believe it's reasonable, but this is the only argument that I can actually give. But if you actually get into the way of thinking why you decide this thing, I can argue about it, and they don't want it, so it's very easy for them just to say it's unreasonable.
Thank you.
No, I just wanted to follow up because Sam said I'm not a lawyer, but you just said something that triggered something for me when you said it's outside of the judicial system in a way. The example here would be, I think, when we had this woman being proposed to be the head of a program at the University of Toronto Law School. They had a human rights program, and she's Asaraf, a known anti-Semite. The dean chose not to appoint her. A committee recommended her. In Israel, it sounds like that case, which sounds to me like it didn't break any law, would have ended up in front of the Supreme Court, because one of the things that happens is the court decides what it's going to hear, which actually doesn't happen here. They don't get to decide to hear everything.
In Israel, we don't have one of the things that Aaron Barak did. Until the 80s, we have a standing right. That means the only person that can go into the court is a person that actually have a straight connection to the damage or to the decision. And what Aaron Barak did, he took it off. He says every person can go to the Supreme Court. Now that gave a lot of power to the Supreme Court, because eventually it can rule in every case, even that there is not even one person that have an influence about this decision.
So it wasn't
I can't say anything.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, so it wasn't a standing issue at that point. It was just finding somebody who is willing to sort of put their name to it and push it forward to that level.
Yeah, for example, we have about demolishing houses in Israel. There is one of the things that Israel tried to do is when terrorists doing a terror attack, to demolish his house in order to make other people scared about going and making terror attacks. So what happened in Israel is that the terrorist usually is not the one that applying it, the terrorist family. There is NGOs that always, in the moment that there is a terror attack, they already going to appeal to the Supreme Court against it. So that's why they're stopping everything, even that there is, even the family doesn't need to go and do it.
Is there a connection between the legal advisors and the Supreme Court?
So there is no straight connection between government legal advisor and the Supreme Court, but a lot of them getting appointed later to the Supreme Court. So, for example, and I'm sorry I'm giving a lot of examples, but it's a good story. So, one of the ways that Israel tried to fight in the terrorists in the end of the 80s was to expel them to Lebanon. So one day, the prime minister decided to take all 400 terrorists, but from the Hamas and the Fatah at this time, and take them in a bus to Lebanon. When they got into Lebanon, so they put them down. The bus was stopped, and immediately someone appealed to the Supreme Court. Aaron Barak was the judge, and he came to his house, to the house of Aaron Barak, and he says, we need to stop it from happening. So now they made a big case that if we can allow to take them out of Israel, not allowed to take them out of Israel.
If the legal advisor.
So the legal advisor at this time, not the legal, the people that appealed, they went into Aaron Barak's house and that stopped it. So what happened is that the government legal advisor was at this time says, I will represent the government decision to expel them. and they usually is not representing by himself. He have a prosecution that this is what their role. They actually they are the specialist of the Supreme Court. So the head of this was named Dorit Beinish. Dorit Beinish, after it, she was appointed to be a Supreme Court judge. At this time, she was like very high role in the prosecution, and she says, "I will not represent the government." So so she decided not to represent the government at this time, and actually the general attorney took him on himself, and he went to represent the government. Eventually, the verdict was that the majority of the judges said that you can expel them from Israel. There was only one that was against it, and that was Aaron Barak. And Aaron Barak was very close with Dorit Beinish. Aaron Barak was in the committee of appointing judges, and not too many years later, he appointed her to be in the Supreme Court. In this way, he took his values and put these people in the Supreme Court. So when you're speaking about the connections between them, there is a lot of connection between the people in the system, even that they don't have like straight professional connection. So that's why I said it's an example to how you have connection between them.
Somebody else had a yep.
Well, first, my name is Jacques Gauthier, for those who have not met me before, and thank you for your insights and your comments on a situation which I'm a jurist, focus on legal issues that relate to Israel, and frankly, I think that everything you're describing is not understood by a lot of people, but it's certainly tragic from my perspective, because it's like some kind of an embrace between parties that are in conflict, which is very detrimental. And so a couple of comments and then my question. I'm right now, because of my focus, which is international law, very concerned about the advisory opinion that has been requested from the International Court of Justice by a resolution of the General Assembly, Resolution 77-400. And there's a deadline for submissions to the court, which is July 25. It's about a month away. And the Palestinians will be making their own submissions. The nations that will support the Palestinians are numerous, probably 15 will make submissions. And in the meantime, Israel has to get its act together very quickly before the 25th, and hopefully other nations will step in. And I've been working on that side. What I've found is that people that should be completely focused and concerned are not, because they're distracted. They're preoccupied with this judicial reform issue. And if you go into a room and there are a bunch of Israelis, they all know where you stand, whether you're on this side or that side. And it's reached the point where even on something which is, from my perspective, it's a defining moment. What the International Court decides on the rights to Jerusalem, the rights to the land, will define other things in the future, which will be very bad. So, can you explain to me what is lots of prophets in the land of Israel, but can you help us understand where this is going to end up? Are we anywhere closer to a resolution? That's question number one. Number two, do people realize how much this is hurting the state of Israel, as the enemies of Israel are so determined to take away the legitimacy? Just in case you don't understand, if the court decision is exactly what I expect it will be, very negative, basically Israelis have no right to be in East Jerusalem, which includes the entirety of the old city, and then no right to be communities in the disputed territories. It's going to lead to a vote at the UN to expel Israel from the United Nations. That's going to be the basis. And if you want to know more about it, just look at the pattern in respect to South Africa when it was expelled from the UN. That's where it's going. And I'm reaching out to government leaders, diplomats, I'm talking to a lot of people. And they all say, yeah, we've got to focus on this. I was supposed to speak this week at Hebrew University in the law school. Spent hours interacting with the dean of the law school. It's not happening because he said nobody wants to hear about anything right now. They just want to deal with what you're talking about. So, question number one, is there an exit? Is there hope? Question number two, do people realize how much it's hurting Israel internationally?
So first of, I will try to answer the question by the order. So first of all, if will be a judicial reform or not will be a judicial reform in the closest time, no one can say. And the reason is that in the politics right now in Israel, there is it depends on Netanyahu mostly. In Netanyahu, if Netanyahu will want to take it, probably it will be part of a judicial reform that will pass, and that's going to bring a lot of people to the streets again. Now, right now, the protest got very low. I mean, today they managed to bring like 10,000 people in the streets. But if we will keep the judicial reform, probably the numbers will raise up again. So the question, if he will be obligated by himself to take it all the way. If he want, he can do it in a day, because in the process in the Knesset already done. So they can pass these laws immediately. So that's depending on Netanyahu. And if because I'm not Netanyahu, I can tell you, I know that there is a lot of forces in Israel that actually, especially from our side and from in the Likud, that wants this to keep going, to judicial reform to pass. And I know that there is a lot of forces, some of them in the Likud, that pushing Netanyahu away from it. So that's Netanyahu mostly. About the second question about the importance, I don't think that Israel, there is two different methods in Israel that dealing with this issue. The first one says we don't recognize the international court and the resolution of the UN about it, and because they are against us anyway. Like for example, in the UN, all the Arab states that are going against us. So we always will have like minority. We'll be in minority, and the international court is biased. That's one way that people think. The other way is that we need to deal with this issue, and some of them doesn't think that it needs to be by the government or maybe more of an organization. Because in the moment that the government recognizes it, that's putting the government in a place, and I'm sorry that this is a question that's not connected to the judicial system reform that we have, but I will answer on this subject. So they said in the moment that as a state we will recognize the international law, international court, to deal with these issues, that actually means that we have a recognition about it, and if we rule against that, so we don't have any say. So that's like the things that I know that people think in Israel right now. I think it's an important issue, and I know there is organizations that work, for this field, and I think that the Israeli government actually need to be taking care of this issue. They need to decide how they will deal with this issue, but they need to deal with this issue. To put it on the side, we know what happens when you put something on the side. It's always gonna go against you. So I definitely think it's an important issue, and you said it's like a month from now. So I think it's something that we need to deal with. I still think that the judicial reform in Israel is very important even to these subjects. And why? Because eventually the judicial system in Israel that stop everything. For example, you're speaking about going to the international court. Who dealing with this in the Israeli government? The legal advisor in the Minister of Justice. There is legal advisor in the Minister of Justice that deal in the international level. So if we have problem with the legal advisors, and if we have problem with the judicial system, eventually every subject's not gonna get what we want. For example, if the Minister of Justice will come to this legal advisor and says, I want you to represent it in a certain way, he can say, I don't agree with it, so I'm not going to represent it in a certain way. And that things happened a lot of time in Israel. So that's why it's so important, first of all, to fix the judicial issue that we have in Israel, because that's going to give us all the power to actually stand in front of these cases.
Thank you.
In many ways, I'm not a lawyer. A lot of what you said, I'm a layperson, I don't fully understand. But I think of myself as reasonable and logical, and I see it how the lens that everybody sees this. You got a leader, a politician, who's got a law case going, Benjamin Netanyahu. And at the same time that he has a case, he wants to change the judicial system. What are the optics of that? And it's those optics, to me, whether it's the best thing to change it or not, is what's causing this aggravation. And I am astounded by his timing of it. Why not get the court case over with? If he's innocent, get it cleared, and then bring it forth. And then, using reason and communication, explain to the public so they understand as best they can the system that's there, and then maybe so many thousands of people wouldn't be rioting in the street. Now, I know as I say this, it's so simple, as if life were so simplistic, and some Jew in Toronto can come up with a solution just like that. I'm sure it's more complicated. But at least I put that
It's
basic thing there, because that's what's on everybody's mind.
It's actually, I'm really happy that you asked this question, because a lot of the protesters says they don't care about the judicial reform. They don't want it to be by corrupted government.
That's it.
And that's a good thing to raise up, because I think we need to deal with this issue. Now, Netanyahu is the prime minister most of the last 13 years, and eventually his case will be at least another 2 or 3 years. And now, if you want, and also I mentioned before the power of the prosecution in Israel and how they deal with people that try to change them. So Yaakov Neiman, when he wanted to try to change the system, he had a criminal investigations against him. And when Daniel Friedman wanted to change, he had the same thing. And when our last president, Ruby Rivlin, when he was supposed to be appointed for Minister of Justice, they opened a criminal investigations against him. So you can say that if someone had a criminal investigations against him, he can't deal with the judicial system. But the problem that it's give a judicial system the option to stop everyone from dealing with it. Now, what Benjamin Netanyahu tried to do before a few months is to be out of the picture. Benjamin Netanyahu didn't represent the judicial reform. Yariv Levin was representing the judicial reform. Yariv Levin is a guy, in full closure, he was a member of my organization before he became a MENKE member. So Yariv Levin was a guy that, first of all, he won the first place of the primaries in the Likud. That means he had a lot of support in the Likud. He was the first in the primaries. Second, in 2009, when he became an MK member, he spoke about the need to fix the judicial system. Simcha Rotman, the head of the committee that dealing with issues in the Knesset, he works in this field for 10 years already. He have an organization that deals exactly in this issue. So what Netanyahu tried to do is to step away and give people that you can't say that they do this stuff because a criminal charges against them to deal with the issue. But eventually, the protester actually brought Netanyahu back, because Netanyahu wanted to sit outside, but the protesters made Gallant and other people to go against it, and Netanyahu didn't have other option now because he's the prime minister. He need to deal with his ministers. So that it's definitely a problem. It's like catch-22.
You've got internal politics.
Yeah. It's catch-22, because eventually you have a minister in criminal charges against him, but if we have a prime minister with criminal charges against him, but if he wasn't in criminal charges against him, who knows if he will have a criminal charges against him, because the prosecution have the power to do it. And anyway, so you say you can't touch the judicial system, so we're gonna stuck in the same judicial system for the next years, and who knows what will be next. So if you're not dealing with this issue, that means the government can't actually control on the state, can't do what they chosen for. And this election, and we need to say, this election, it was election when everyone know about the criminal charges of Netanyahu, that he already was on a trial. So the people went into vote and vote Netanyahu when they know that they have it, and there was 64 mandates that choose him when they know that he have it. And that says only one thing. It's not saying that believe Netanyahu. It says that they doesn't believe the prosecution. So they want him to change the judicial system.
Sort of on that question, so and sort of the whole, this gets I think sort of into the inner politics of Israel as well. Well, definitely Netanyahu has been, like you said, has pushed for in the past the reforms and.
No, he actually didn't. Push.
Oh, sorry, not pushed for it. You said he's been quiet on it, but when he's brought in this, especially this new coalition, which I think a lot of people could say is probably not the coalition that most people have dreamed up and would have expected to have seen at that time. It seems like it's certain members of the coalition, not so much within the Likud camp per se, but sort of these outers of the Likud that are really the ones that are sort of the big voices that are pushing for these judicial reforms. So is that sort of in trying to maintain power and sort of keeping everybody happy, is that sort of pushing, is this more of an issue as well with just how coalitions, in order to have a functioning coalition, you sort of have to give some and take some, scratch your back, I scratch mine, and is that really what, well, it might not be in Netanyahu's best interest. If he wants to remain in power, he's going to have to do something about these reforms. Is that the bigger issue?
Yeah. So Netanyahu actually, he wasn't in the favor of any judicial reform, and we need to say it. I mean, Netanyahu have a lot of quotes when he says, "I'm the protector of the Supreme Court, and I will not let anyone touch the Supreme Court." That was like a few years ago, 2017 and more. Here he says, "I'm the protector," and suddenly everything changed. And why? Because first of all, and I can say that's just my interpretation, but the left made him do it. Because in the moment that the left party says we're not gonna go with Netanyahu, he didn't have any other option, and Netanyahu always likes left parties in coalition. And if you look back, you see that every coalition of Netanyahu had at least one left or centered party. So now Netanyahu didn't have any other option because they said "Rak lo Bibi," we're not gonna go with Netanyahu. So in order to make a coalition, he have to go to the people that maybe he didn't want to go with them. But this is how the coalition works. The system in Israel is working in the way that you have a coalition, and you need, in order to have a coalition, you need to make people happy and to put their own values on. And I think this is actually in every place that you have certain parties that may need to make coalition. So, but still, if we look on the last election, and that is something that is very important, if we look on the last election and the promises of the parties in the coalition to the public, you will see that the Likud promised time and time, he promised about fixing the judicial system. And you look on the Tzionut Datit party and you see that they promised. And you see even the Haredic party was speaking of in their audience, not in the general audience, speaking about fixing the judicial system. So all the parties that involved right now in the coalition was chosen by fixing the judicial system.
And so what you're saying is pretty much, so what you're saying, well, there's still like a need, the Likud still feels that there's a need for judicial reform. They're definitely not, their faction of the coalition is not the one standing out there pushing it the hardest. It's definitely the other members of the coalition.
Yeah, the Likud have 30 mandates. 30 mandates, it means 30 MK members.
Yeah.
They definitely have different voices in the Likud, and there is different people in the Likud that thinking different things. So there is people but in the Likud that are not in the favor of a judicial reform. Most of the people in the Likud definitely in the favor of a judicial reform. The question if the Likud will be enough people to go with a judicial reform, because eventually you have 64 mandates, and if 4 of them will decide not to go with judicial reform, you're not going to have majority of the voters.
Sort of related to one another, I understood from something I read that in 2009, Lapid spoke in favor of judicial reform. And somehow that seems to have slipped out of everybody's mind. So that puts me in mind that this whole protest is not about judicial reform. It's just about getting rid of the government. Can you speak to that? I'm reading
Yeah.
that now in a number of sources. My sources are biased, I'm reading Carolyn Glick and Modi Kadar and a few others, and they say this judicial reform thing was concocted before they even announced the reforms.
I opened my lecture, my talk today, in the say that if we're speaking about the judicial reform, we first need to understand that it's not about the judicial reform. And I said it because eventually, Yair Lapid spoke about judicial reform, Benjamin Bennett spoke about judicial reform, everyone spoke about judicial reform. Their problem is not with the judicial reform. Their problem is what the judicial reform will be and who will control the judicial the judicial system after it. So eventually it's always getting into the point of the position about if it will be my people there or it will be the other people there. So when you speak about values, like I'm really trying to do the things that I think that is good for Israel is in the terms of structure and values. That means, for example, what the judicial reform says now, that the coalition will appoint the Supreme Court judges, that can go against me. Because if we will be left-wing coalitions, that means the Supreme Court will be against me because they appoint the Supreme Court judges. But I don't care because I said I think it's a good that they will represent the people. And if I losing the election time after time after time, that actually made the Supreme Court more in the left, so that's my problem, that I didn't have the majority of the people in Israel that understood the things that I want to. So I need to educate the people about it.
So did Netanyahu just give up something significant when he put somebody on the selection committee that's from the left?
So Netanyahu actually, I can't give an excuse for what Netanyahu does. I mean, eventually, the MK member, you are going to have 2 MK members in the Committee of Appointing Judges if they're not going to change the way of appointing judges. And one of them is already from the opposition.
Right.
That means we're gonna, if the other side got one candidate, got one representative. Now, if we're gonna lose the Bar Association representative also, tomorrow we have election. So if we're gonna lose the Bar Association, that means another 2 from the other side. Now you have also the 3 judges. So that gives 6 from 9 to the other side. Now, 6 from 9, and I don't know if you remember, but I told you that in order to put judges to appoint judges to the Supreme Court, you need 7 from 9. That means the coalition also have a veto because they still have got 3. They have 1 MK member and 2 ministers. So you say maybe it's not so important, but it's very important because the Committee of Appointing Judges not only appoint Supreme Court judges, they also appoint regular judges and district judges. And they appoint by the majority. That means you need 5 votes. So what Netanyahu does now actually gave a lot of power to the judges and the other side to appoint regular judges in all the other courts.
You said that every Knesset gets to appoint 2 judges. Is that true, or what?
In average.
It depends on when
On average. There is, in Israel, every Knesset average of 2 years. Because of all the elections that we have, and because of the system, the way of the system works in Israel, that if you want, that if you have to have 61 mandates. So a lot of time when one party wants too much and the prime minister doesn't want to give her, or she has something problematic, for example, we went into, you remember all the 5 elections that we have in a year and a half. So what was the reason of going to this election? I don't know if you remember, but it was the decision of the Supreme Court against the serving of the Haredim. The Knesset was passed law in the Knesset that said the Haredim will get ptor from going to the army, from serving in the army, and like in certain ways. It's not like everyone, but they gave them a specific law, and you can like it, you cannot like it, but anyhow, the Supreme Court overruled it. In the moment that he overruled it, we got into a problem because the Haredic says, if they overruled and we need to serve the army, we don't want to be in the coalition anymore because we can influence. So actually, the Supreme Court took us to all the elections that we have.
Right.
And eventually, when you're speaking about I forgot the line of a thought. So so the Supreme Court took us to the election that we have, and you see that the Haredik left the coalition. So what happened is that in average every 2 years we have a different Knesset, and in average there is every year one judge that is getting appointed. So that's a kind that's mean.
It's just by coincidence that it works.
It's not by coincidence, because it's the way that the system works. Because you can choose only someone when someone retired. So
Right.
because they are in different times, that means every time someone retired in different
But
times.
the rate of retirement.
Yeah, it's
works
rate.
Works out to about the rate of the coalition change.
Yeah.
Could you speak a bit more about the legal problems of Netanyahu and how this is all related to the legal advisors or to lawfare, politics turning into lawfare?
So this is one issue that I never have opinion about, because I don't know what Netanyahu did or not what Netanyahu didn't do. I mean, I think no one can know. Maybe all the people that actually seen all the evidence can decide. But I'm not an expert for Netanyahu cases. But I can say one thing: the things that Netanyahu had the criminal charges against him is very minor thing. There is none even one suspicious of something very severe. And all the state of Israel went for years now in a train without without I would say that gonna strike one day, because it's not
brakes.
without breaks, just because of these criminal charges. So it seems to me that it may be something that we didn't supposed to deal with. And I'm going to say even more. I think Netanyahu was elected sometimes because of the criminal charges against him. Because a lot of people says if the prosecution want to take our representative off, we will vote just for him. So that makes us in a situation, very bad, very problematic situation in Israel. So I don't know if you want to know what will be in Netanyahu cases. So right now Netanyahu is sitting on his trial, and is going every week he's not going, but his lawyers are in court, and they are investigate all the witnesses from both sides, and that will take probably another 2 years or 3 years of trial. So that will take time. So we are stuck in this situation. Nothing gonna change in the nearest time, and this is why people actually doesn't care about it in the right now, because they says we can't go by these things.
I have a logistical question about the process. If you have people coming to court without standing, does the court get backlogged? And what is the turnaround time for Supreme Court rulings?
So one of the ways that the Supreme Court actually rules, ways of dealing issues that it doesn't like, is to delay the ruling. For example, there was a law that was overruled by the Supreme Court named the regulation law. The regulation law was supposed to take all the illegal settlements in Yudan and Shomron and make them legal. And that was passed in the Knesset in 2016. That was in the beginning of the government of Bennett, Netanyahu. Shaked was Minister of Justice, and at this time, and Lieberman was part of this also. So that time, the Supreme Court didn't want to rule against it, because it says if I will rule against it, they're gonna go against me, and I don't want them now to go and make laws against the Supreme Court. So he delayed the ruling, and you know when he published it, month after they replaced the government. So that was in 2020. So 4 years it took him in very let's say it's not so complicated case. So it took him 4 years. Sometimes the ruling is it can be in a week. If they want a ruling in a week, they can do it in a week. But no one can tell them when to publish the ruling. So that's in this way they actually have influence. If I mentioned before that activism doesn't go only by the number of the laws that they overruled, that's a good example, because sometimes you can do it just by delaying. For example, if you want the government to be replaced, so the next government not going to do the same.
And the same thing I imagine in prioritizing which cases get heard.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was some people can appeal to the Supreme Court and eventually and immediately get heard, and some need to wait months. So you can say that it's depend in how much if the case is immediately, how much you need it. But you can see there is difference between which cases by the values of the judges.
And in terms of the term of the 70 years for Supreme Court judges, is that on the table? Did Simcha Rothman feel that was appropriate?
So I believe that you can't do too many changes together. That means if I will decide that I'm gonna elect the politician will elect the judges, I can't also take off Supreme Court judges. The independency of Supreme Court is not going by who appoint the Supreme Court, it's going by who can fire the Supreme Court judges. Because when the Supreme Court judge got elected, if I can touch him, that means he's independent. There is so many different examples of judges that was appointed from the right and went to the left when was in the Supreme Court. So, and the Supreme Court and the right can do anything about it. So, in this way, if you touch the independency, that's something that I think can definitely be problematic, because eventually we want the system to be balanced and we want them to be independent, and that's actually a good thing when I'm saying there is balance, because these judges will be independent in the ruling against the Knesset.
You know, those who are concerned about the current constitution of a court, it could be worse. In the U.S., I believe that Supreme Court judges continue until death.
Yeah.
We used to have
Canada,
that too, right? Or till
in Canada, it's up to the age of 75.
It used to be till death.
So to the extent that you have judges you don't like, it could have been a lot worse.
And building on that, because when you talk about the left, and I presuppose you're on the right, I get very confused because,
I need to use different
left
terms.
and right. So when I think left hand, right hand.
They don't mean the same thing these
I know.
days.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm asking.
Mhm.
So when to use an example, when I think of left and right, we know a lot about the American system, and you get a Republican president and he or she appoints a Republican judge. We think they're the right, and a Democrat are the left, and the right leans towards anti-abortion. The left is pro-choice, a woman's choice. I'm using these as simple examples because they're so out there. And same thing, LGBTQ rights, left, anti-education on that, right. So in Israel, are you saying when you talk about the left, is it somewhat similar that if there were more judges who were on the right, they would deny women the right to determine whether they needed an abortion? Would they be repressive of the gay community in, say, Tel Aviv? Would the left say are more, well, let's be more friendly with the Palestinians? What do these things mean so we can have a better understanding, perception, to visualize a left and right judge?
I like your questions.
It's
a good thing to clear by. So there is difference in the terms between the United States and Israel in left and right. Usually, when we're speaking about right and left in Israel, the most of the people speaking about our rights about Judea and Shomron, Judea and Samaria.
About which?
Judea and Samaria.
The West Bank.
The West Bank. Usually, when we're speaking about the right and left, is the left doesn't believe that we have right to be in the West Bank, and the right believe that we have the West Bank. Another issue that going with the left and right is how you deal with the terror in Israel. One is going by mostly the right says we need to hit them hard, and the left says we need to do a peace agreement with them. So that's another issue that goes by right and wing. Now, today we are adopting some of the things from United States, So there is, for example, in the protest right now, there is, the storytale series, the סיפורה של שפחה, the maid tale series. There is about probably I didn't say the name right, but it's about a maid that like with wearing red clothes.
Handmaid's Tale.
Handmaid's Tale. So
the novel,
so-
Handmaid's
Right,
Tale.
right.
So there is a TV series that become very famous, and in Israel, in the protest, in the protest, you can see a lot of women that wearing these things because they says we are scared about the women's rights. So that's actually something that came to Israel right in this day. Another thing is usually between the religious and non-religious, but that's not always going by right and left, because the Haredi are not exactly right or left, and the secular, there is a lot of secular people that in the right they are definitely more traditional. The right is mostly more traditional, and the left more secular, but eventually they don't want like a religious state. They just care about some things of like the Jewish nation state. So that's how it's going in Israel. So if I will change the phrase that I spoke, I will say mostly about people that want Jewish state or Jewish nation state, and people that want all citizen state. That's why I start in the beginning to say this is the big argument that we have. And if I look about the verdicts and the rulings of the Supreme Court judges, I will see that this is the line where it crosses between how we handle terror, how in the cases of about the Judaism of a state, and in the cases of about the legitimacy of us living in Israel.
And I guess all the human rights issues.
Yeah, so human rights
the
actually,
citizens
so human rights, it's not right and left, and that's something my organization account as a human rights organization. You know why? Because we are defending of the human rights of the people in Israel. So when you're speaking about human rights, the question is what human rights we are protecting of. For example, all the human rights organization in Israel was helping the infiltrators in Israel to stay in Israel. Now, the infiltrators that came from Africa had a lot of problems when they came. First of all, they're not legally in Israel. Second, the influence of the Judaism of a state. I mean, if we're going to have majority or non-majority of Jewish people in Israel. And third, they have a lot of crime. And they hurt a lot of Jewish people in Israel. So, and rape and murdered and a lot of this stuff. So, they says we need to keep them here. I says we need to help the people that they live in their neighborhood and defend their human rights. So which human rights are more? Who is human rights? I mean, human rights. It's always the question: which human rights you are choosing to defend of. When a human rights organization go and appeal to the court against the demolition of a house of a terrorist, so I think it's not a human right, because I think it gets my right to live in peace, to live, because this terrorist coming and kill me. So for me, when I'm defending my right to live in Israel, I'm a human rights organization. So this is why human rights is not right and left, and this is how they phrase it, but it's definitely not about right or left. I'm a human rights organization also.
It seems that indigenous rights, you call it Samaria, West versus West Bank, it's again another lens. Some people are putting a very narrow lens, like a woman I taught with, much to my surprise, I met her husband, he was Palestinian, and he was saying that it's the British that caused all the problems. Well, I'm reading history, and I go back a lot further, and it seems to me after Muhammad died, the caliphs invaded a lot of areas, and with a weapon to people's heads said, either you convert to Islam or we kill you. And that's when there was a mass exodus, and again during the Ottoman Empire. So to me, when I look at the history way back, we're talking about Jews returning to their land much the same way the indigenous tribes of North America have rights to their original land, and And that's what we're trying to claim, and I don't know if that has any impact in the fight that you're
International court.
dealing with in the international court.
But I think,
It
Brian,
did-
you just pointed out, I think, exactly what Yotam was saying. That in many ways, and it's shocking to me, the so-called left, it's the wrong word, but a lot of the people in Israel proper who are seen to be left do not care about Shimon and Judea, even if they can
They
be
don't
given-
care about which?
Shimon and Judea,
Judea.
Samaria and Judea.
Oh,
So even if they agree on the history, like they're not going to say the history's wrong. They're not going to say Jews weren't there. They're all going
Right.
to say the Jews
yeah.
had Shiloh and Hebron, and they're not going to deny that. They just don't care if it becomes a Palestinian state.
No,
That's a huge
they,
difference.
they look on the first of all, they don't have the connection that we have as a Jewish to the land, and what they feel is that if they don't have a connection, so why not give up on these areas and be separate from the Palestinians, and that's why we're gonna have a peace. So you know what? Even sometimes the people like in the right, so-called, I mean the people that have connection to this land, says I don't care about giving peace for my land, but it's not gonna get what I want. So why to give a piece of my land? I mean we tried it twice. One in Oslo Codes,
One in the Oslo
the
Accords.
Oslo Codes,
Right.
that we gave up on a huge amount of land, and what we got is intifada, that people got just terrorists going all over. We gave weapons to the Palestinian Authority that came against us and murdered Israeli citizens. I mean, in 2000, around the 2000s, there was even one Israeli that didn't know from close someone that got murdered in these terror attacks. I was a student that went into school, and the bus was exploded by bomb. I mean, just after I almost got into the bus and it got exploded. I knew people. I had people that was studying with me, students in high school that got murdered because they are Jews. So our perspective is not about just we are so stubborn that says we doesn't want to give up anything. We are stubborn. Yeah, the Jewish nation is the most stubborn nation in the world. But this is why we are still exist. But we understood that this is not the way that we're gonna get peace. We tried it. We tried it in Gaza Strip. We tried it in the Oslo Codes, and all the time it came against us. What happened in Gaza Strip? What we went out of Gaza Strip. Since then, thousands of rockets hit Israeli cities, and people got murdered by these rockets. So this is gonna be the solution. So I think that as a righty in Israel, I'm actually more realistic, and the left is less realistic because they still look on the things in their eyes of, if I will give up on land, this is what they want. But I listen to the Arabs, and they doesn't listen to the Arabs. You know what the Palestinian says? They says we want all Israel.
I know, I was just reading the Hamas covenant.
So that's the difference. I listen to the Arabs. You know, it's funny. You can cross a line in Israel where the right and the left were separate in the election, and you can see that most of the right places is the places that living by Arabs, and most of the left places is the places that doesn't meet Arabs in their lives. I mean, it's easy to live in Tel Aviv and says I'm a lefty. Let's give you Judea and Samaria. But I met a lot of Arabs in my life, and I spoke with them. You know, I think they are actually a person. So I spoke with these people, and you hear what they are saying. Don't listen to the media. Listen to them, and they want all the land of Israel. So a lot of them actually in the Palestinian Authority are good people that want to live in peace.
Yeah.
A lot of them. Our problem is that you can't know who is good people or who is not good people, because this is how they act as a nation.
Yeah.
So from this point, we have a problem. I'm saying nation because it's question if we are a nation or not nation, but I will say
I know
in general.
you mean
So
as a group.
so for us, this is I think this is the difference, because the people that living by always going to the right because they understand this is the solution. There is no easy solution as peace agreement, and the left doesn't go by, so they're doing a peace agreement on our account.
We're going to have to bring this fascinating discussion to an end.
I was going to say, maybe as a closing thing, there's been a lot of talk about, with President Herzog has been moderating some compromise talks, as is there going to be a winner and loser in these judicial reform discussions, or do you think that some form of compromise agreement that'll keep sort of both sides
So
happy and sort of progress past this stalemate of just protests in the street?
So first of all, the discussion of Herzog over.
It's
The,
over.
the left says that Lapid says that he's not going to be involved on this conversation anymore, so it's over. And now what actually speak in Israel in the recent days is about going one-sided. So I don't think that the left leaders of the parties, I mean Lapid and Gantz, actually have wants to go to compromise. And why? Because politically it's not good for them. Their supporters doesn't want it to be compromised. So why you don't go against your voters? So because of this, and the right parties was actually willing to do a compromise. This is why they were going to the and they didn't do it one-sided till today. So they stopped it and went into negotiate. So what happened is that you don't have a political environment to make a compromise, and that's why I think it's going to be one-sided. I said I don't think all the judicial reform will pass. I think we're going to take few things that less controversial, apparently, more, and I figure that will be less controversial, and start from them. What's going to be in the next month, no one knows.
Fair enough. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Unless,
Okay, so on
you.
that note,
Thank you,
I'm gonna
Yotam.
thank you, Yotam,
you.
for a fabulous discussion and clarification on so many issues. Thank you, Noah, for
Absolutely.
helping us in the conversation. Thank everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. And Jacques, I know you want a little more time, so I
Yep.
think Yotam will make himself available.
No.
And I hope that the rest of you will follow what CAEF is doing and join us for more webinars and in-person events.